Jennifer and Sean, if you would, can you talk about how the standards started out, the framework, and then how they've come to where they are?
Well, I can start by just mentioning that this whole thing was a two-step process started by the National Research Council, which convened a panel of experts, 18 experts, including Nobel laureates around the country in all the different disciplines, engineering and K-12 education. And they put out a public draft, I believe, in 2010, and the final framework was released in 2011. And what that did was pull together all the research on what we know of science education, how students learn cognitive science, all the advances in science in the last decades, and figured out what it is that we really need students to know and be able to do by the end of 12th grade. So that framework formed the foundation for the next generation science standards. And Achieve was tasked with coordinating the standards with the states and all these writers on behalf of the states. And so it's a good part to transition over to Sean to talk about the actual process of writing the standards with the states.
Yeah, that is a pretty good transition. So a number of the states were involved in the first review of the draft of the framework that Jennifer mentioned that happened in the summer of 2010. The Council of State Science Supervisors convened some regional groups trying to get the first draft of the framework in front of as many eyes as possible as people in the science education community to give them some feedback. And so once the framework reached its final form in the summer of 2011, was handed off to Achieve, Achieve opened up this process whereby states that were interested could apply to be lead states for the development of the standards. And Kentucky was one of the states that made such an application, and we were accepted along with a pretty good number of others. In fact, it started out as 20, but it eventually ended up being 26 states that were involved in the process. And so each of the lead states convened committees of science education experts. In our case, they were primarily K-12 science teachers, but we also tapped into the higher ed community and the teacher ed community, and professional engineers and other interested parties, as well as informal and non-formal science education throughout the state, to assemble a committee. And this committee was tasked with reviewing drafts of the standards as Achieve pushed them forward. We saw a first draft of just sort of basically the configuration of the standards in late 2011, just sort of a skeletal framework. I think there were 23 individual topics at the time, or 23 individual performance. Somehow the number 23 ended up in my head, but it was just sort of a skeleton. It was sort of a proof of concept draft, and we gave feedback on that. And then with each successive round of feedback, we saw a more complete document. And eventually, we moved forward to the last public draft in January of this year, and then the final publication in April of this year. And the thing about the process that I think that really needs to be mentioned is the fact that it wasn't just lip service. We saw what the committee did reflected in changes that happened from one iteration to the next. Things that we would see, and the people from the different lead states would converse amongst each other as well. What we would find is things that most people agreed were changes or additions that needed to be made always showed up in the next draft. So I can say from personal experience that the process of developing the standards really was one of input from the states. We were listened to very much during the process.
Okay. And I would just add that the writing committee themselves was a group of 41 writers, half of whom were current K-12 classroom teachers, and most of the rest are former teachers, but now university professors or researchers in other ways, current engineers, various areas of expertise. A very impressive group. So that group met together very regularly, about every couple of months during the whole writing process, to look at all the feedback and discuss and argue and finally come out with each successive draft.